Hello friends, what's up? It's Jaime here. Welcome back to another Fangirl Fridays video. Because International Trans Day of Visibility and in honor of the trans rights readathon that is currently going on, I wanted to share some of my favorite book recommendations by trans and non-binary authors. So without further ado, let's get into the video. The books that I mentioned in this video will be divided into sections based on genre, but just so that you know, the majority of books that I will be talking about in this video will be either memoirs or nonfiction books of some kind, just so that you're not like, because I'm gonna mention like a few novels and then we're gonna go like right into like all the nonfiction. First up, we have Felix Ever After, which is a YA novel by Kacen Callender. In this novel, we follow Felix Love, a black trans teen who falls in love for the first time while grappling with his identity and contending with an anonymous student who starts sending him transphobic messages. While this novel could definitely be heartbreaking at times, like it really did break my heart sometimes, it was still so sweet to watch Felix fall in love, and I definitely recommend reading this book or listening to the audiobook. Next, we have Nevada, a novel by Imogen Binney. In Nevada, we follow Maria, a trans woman from New York who, after finding out that her girlfriend has cheated on her, steals her car and decides to go on essentially a road trip of self-exploration. She also has a ton of heroin. As Maria travels west on her journey of self-discovery, she meets James Henson in Nevada, who she immediately realizes is trans, but James themselves has not recognized this yet. I personally recommend the audiobook of this novel because it's narrated by Imogen Binney, and I also really recommend that you read the afterword because it added so much to my understanding of the ending, and I think that that will do so for other people who read this novel. Next, we have How Far the Light Reaches, which is an essay collection by Sabrina Imbler. Sabrina Imbler is a queer, trans, mixed-race science journalist whose essay collection marries their knowledge of marine biology with their experiences and multiple identities as a queer, trans, and mixed-race individual. Each essay focuses on usually one specific sea creature, and then that sea creature serves as a catalyst for Imbler's essays on family and race and sexuality and gender. These essays also tend to include necropsy reports where Imbler details their past queer relationships and why those relationships fell apart. I really enjoyed this essay collection. I thought that it was very insightful the way that Sabrina Imbler talked about race and queer identity and trans identities, and also was very informative about sea creatures that I previously had no knowledge of. Though I quickly wanted to call attention to the, I believe it's the Beware the Sand Striker essay to provide a sexual assault trigger warning, because this essay, pretty much the whole chapter talks about sexual assault in a pretty graphic way as it pertains to Imbler's experiences as well as those of Lorena Bobbitt. So that's just something to be aware of. Next, we have The Transgender Issue, An Argument for Justice, which is a nonfiction book by Sean Fay. Throughout this book, Sean Fay details how transgender people are affected by a myriad of societal issues, including but not limited to social class, employment, housing security, police violence, prisons, and sex work. Framing the trans liberation movement within the context of social and economic activism, Sean Fay argues that trans liberation will improve society as a whole. Fay also calls attention to how British media, newspapers, television news are particularly hostile to trans people. This book is a must-read for people who want to learn about trans liberation and is definitely something that I recommend that you read for this International Trans Day of Visibility. Next, we have Genderqueer, a graphic novel / memoir by Maya Kobabe. Genderqueer details Kobabe's exploration of Ayer non-binary and asexual identities throughout Ayer adolescence and adulthood. This graphic novel memoir addresses subjects such as gender dysphoria, gender euphoria, asexuality through narration and illustrations. Kobabe chronicles significant experiences from Ayer life, including Ayer first period, learning what it means to be trans, and Ayer first relationship. This graphic novel is the perfect blend of educational while also being personal. Maya is such a talented artist, and I'm really in awe of the way that Ayer were able to convey such a sweet but also powerful message of coming out, if you choose to do so, how it is a continuous process. It is not linear, it shifts and it changes. Your identities may shift and change through so much humor and heart. And as an A-spec person myself, it was so validating to hear someone talk about their ace identity. Next, we have Some Assembly Required, a memoir by Aaron Andrews. In this memoir, Aaron details his coming of age as a young trans person and talks about his experience undergoing gender reassignment surgery his junior year of high school. Aaron recounts his struggles with getting kicked out of his private school, the physical and mental changes following his transition, and his relationship with a young trans woman and the subsequent heartbreak. I've said this before on the channel because I've talked about this book before on the channel, but this was my first book that I ever read by an openly trans author, and it was my first exposure to transgender identities as a child, and for that reason, and just because it's a pretty good book, I will continue to recommend it. Next, we have Hijab Butch Blues, a memoir by Lamia H. Throughout this memoir, Lamia explores the Quran through a queer and trans lens as they draw parallels between their childhood experiences and famous stories from the Quran. Each chapter focuses on a different Islamic figure and story and demonstrates how Lamia's intersecting identities as a queer person, a non-binary person, and a devout Muslim don't have to cancel each other out. Hijab Butch Blues is one of my favorite books of all time. I cannot recommend it enough. This book serves as a perfect reminder that there is not one singular queer or trans experience that is correct. There is no correct way to be queer or trans. While every queer and trans person should be able to come out on their own terms, on their own timeline, every queer and trans person should also be allowed to remain closeted without that diminishing their identity. You are not less queer or trans for not being out by societal standards. And while, yes, coming out can be liberating for some people, it can also be restricting or even dangerous for others. And you don't get to decide what coming out means or what being closeted means for any person except for yourself. And Hijab Butch Blues is a perfect example of that. Next, we have Dear Sendirin, a Black Spirit memoir by Akwege Emezi. Through a series of candid and intimate letters to family, friends, and lovers, Emezi chronicles their tumultuous career as a writer, their similarly tumultuous relationships with family and past lovers, as well as the transformative revelations and decisions that they made about their body and gender. This book is actually one of the greatest books I've ever read, and it is my first Akwege Emezi book, but it will not be the last because holy shit. I really don't have the words to fully express just how incredible this book is. Incredible feels like an understatement. I don't have the correct vocabulary to properly express just how much I love this book. I came out of it feeling like a different person. There's a little blurb on the book by Vulture that describes Akwege Emezi as a once-in-a-generation voice, and I could not agree more. The way that they write about race and gender and love and writing itself is so profound but also familiar, if that makes sense. Like, the way that Emezi is able to conceptualize ideas and like thoughts that I've had and like just like give voice to those feelings in a way that just makes perfect sense. Like, I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but it's just amazing. I'm just like, how did you do that? Like that, oh my gosh, like I can only dream about writing the way that Akwege Emezi does. They are just, they're phenomenal. Like, they're, wow. So if you somehow could not guess, I'm telling you, go read this book. Like, go read it right now. It is the perfect book for this International Trans Day of Visibility, but also just the perfect book to read literally whenever, at any point throughout this year. But I'm telling you to read it now because it is fantastic. I particularly recommend, I mean, I have the physical copy, but I particularly recommend the audiobook because Akwege Emezi narrates it, and they have a very soothing voice that is also just very powerful and poignant and makes for fantastic narration. I didn't get to finish filming before because I had to pick up Adam from class, and now I have a headache and I don't really feel like being on camera, so we're switching over to voiceover. But to wrap up this video, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the trans-authored books that I'm currently reading and the ones that I plan to read, the ones that are on my immediate TBR.
The first book is Life as a Unicorn by Amru Al-Kadi. It is a memoir. I've been listening to the audiobook on Spotify and it is so good. Oh my gosh, I have like an hour and a half left in the audiobook. It is so good. It's a very heartbreaking book, but it's also just so well written. Amru is such an incredible writer and an incredible narrator too. I've really been enjoying their narration. And the book is just like talking about Amru's experiences having to reconcile their queer and non-binary identities with their Muslim upbringing and also having to deal with their internalized racism that they felt as an Iraqi person. And it's just so good. It's a really excellent book. I definitely really recommend that you read it. And then the second book that I just started reading is Before We Were Trans by Dr. Kit Hayam, which is just a history of trans people across the globe from multiple different cultures and backgrounds and like what constitutes trans history. It's really, really good. Very informative, very educational. It's definitely like, I consider it along with like the transgender issue to be like quintessential, like trans authored and like just like trans content to read. Okay, so moving on to my trans authored TBR. First, we have I Kissed Shara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston, which I believe is a YA novel, but it's a novel. YA, I'm not entirely certain. But it's about this girl, Chloe Green, who is kind of thrust into this unlikely alliance where her and the group that she's working with have to decipher clues left behind by the titular Shara Wheeler, who has disappeared a month before graduation after having kissed all these blows. So like she kissed, Chloe kissed Shara, and then it's like two other people, I think, who kissed her, and they're all working together to figure out where the fuck did she go. And I just think it's gonna be fun. I can't wait to read it. Okay, and next we have Queen of the Conquered, which is a fantasy novel by Kacen Callender. The story is set in like this Caribbean-inspired fantasy world where our main character, Sojourner Rose, is essentially seeking revenge for the massacre of her family and the enslavement of her people. And then the last book on my immediate TBR is King of the Rising, which is a fantasy novel by Kacen Callender and the conclusion to Queen of the Conquered. I'm very excited for Queen of the Conquered and King of the Rising, particularly because first of all, as you could probably again tell from this video, most of the trans authored books I've read are nonfiction of some kind, which are great. They're all great books. Like I love them. But I definitely want to, diversify my trans authored reads. Like I want to read more fantasy, I want to read some science fiction. I want to read some more like contemporary like fiction and like stuff. Some romance too. Like I want to read a bunch of other genres, so I'm very excited. And I love fantasy, and I've never read like a fantasy book or series with like a Caribbean inspired setting, so I'm super excited for Queen of the Conquered and King of the Rising. All right, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you guys have in the comments if you guys have any trans authored book recs, especially if they're fiction, particularly if they're fantasy. I would love to check them out. And yeah, once again, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I upload Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, except when I don't. And I'm gonna go lie down now, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.